You're listening to The Artist Athlete, episode 67. This podcast is dedicated to CIRCUS. It's a place for professionals in the industry to share their stories, viewpoints, and information, and a place for outsiders to get a sneak peek into this world. Hey friends, fans, and enemies, I'm Shannon McKenna. I'm the host of the Artist Athlete podcast and the founder of theartistathlete.com. As always, shout out to my Patreons. My friend Jen told me the other day, she wrote me on Instagram and was like, hey Shannon, you know that when people go on Patreon and they subscribe to your Patreon account, they're actually called patrons. They're not called Patreons. You keep saying Patreons on the podcast, and I think that's weird. And thank you for that, Jen. But I still call them Patreons because patron is a description of what they are. But I think because it's Patreon, the site, the people who give small amounts of money every month to help the podcast and other art projects and people who are creating succeed should be called Patreons as well. So I call anyone out there who's a patron of the Artist Athlete podcast on Patreon a Patreon because it sounds special. So if you're a Patreon of the Artist Athlete podcast, you're also a patron of the Artist Athlete podcast, and whatever you want to be called, I want to thank you. You help this podcast succeed, you help it continue, and you're dope for doing that. If you want to be a Patreon or a patron, go to Patreon, Patreon, patreon.com/theartistathlete. My guest today is Christine Van Leeuw. Christine is an American aerialist and acrobat and former champion acrobatic gymnast. She is a 7-time national champion, and she was named the 1988 Olympic Female Athlete of the Year for Sports Acrobatics and named Athlete of the Decade for the 1980s by the U.S. Sports Acrobatic Federation. She was inducted into the USSA Acrogymnastics Hall of Fame and the World Acrobatics Society Gallery of Honor. Whew. Currently, she's a professional aerialist and acrobat. She has toured with Paul McCartney. She's performed for 2 Grammy Award ceremonies, the Winter Olympics, the American Music Awards, and the Miss Universe pageant. She choreographed the aerials for Britney Spears' World Tour and the Stars on Ice US Tour. She's worked as a trainer on the television show Celebrity Circus, which I haven't seen, but I hear it's hilarious. Since 2008, Van Leeuw has performed with Cirque du Soleil. She's currently a teacher, a performer, and a keynote speaker. And in today's interview, Christine shares so many awesome stories that I think come from a lot of her speeches that she gives all over the world. So listen in. Here's my interview with Christine Van Leeuw. Christine Van Leeuw, welcome to the Artist Athlete podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Can you kind of summarize who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm a professional aerialist and I'm a global keynote speaker. And I was a former champion athlete. I was a 7-time national champion in acrobatic gymnastics. Growing up. So,
wait,
yeah.
You were 7-time national championship in gymnastics?
Yeah. In acrobatic
cool.
Gymnastics, which is the partnering gymnastics sport.
Oh, got it. Did you do duo or trio work?
Duo. I was mixed pair, so boy, girl.
Okay, gotcha. How did you find aerial arts?
Well, after retiring from competition, I spent a few years teaching everything, acrobatics, gymnastics, dance, aerobics, you name it, I taught it. But I felt like there was something missing in my life. I got married and I moved to Italy for 3 years, and then we moved to Orlando. And while I was in Orlando, A friend of mine said, I'm coming down to audition for Cirque du Soleil. And I was like, well, wow, I'll go and be your cheerleader. And so I went to just go watch him do the audition. And while I was sitting there on the bleachers, all the 25 athletes and artists filed in, and I noticed that my hands were shaking. And so I gripped the bleachers to steady them. It was kind of weird because the room wasn't cold at all. It was like 80 degrees in there. But I gripped the bleachers, and then my whole body started rocking back and forth. And then it was like I realized that I was watching my life from the outside. And I was like, wow, those strangers, that's my family. That art form is my home. So yeah, that's pretty much that was my intro into aerial artistry and the Cirque arts.
So wait, so you were a mixed pair flyer and then decided to be an aerialist?
Yes, exactly. And the similarities between my sport and aerial artistry are that they're both very, like the name of your podcast, they're the artist athlete,
That's branding, girl.
I always thought of myself as an artist athlete, like as a competitive acro gymnast. I was as much an athlete as I was an artist. And as an aerialist, I'm as much as an athlete as I am an artist. And I love the name of your podcast. When I saw that, I was like, what?
Thank you. Yeah. I think that this is something people miss a lot about circus arts in general, is that there's the aspect and element of both. Yeah. So I really wanted to highlight that by just naming it.
Can I tell you a quick story that was kind of my learning lesson? Like, it was kind of a turning point for me, an aha moment.
Please.
So when I was a new aerialist, I was hired to perform. Well, this is kind of a funny story. It was New Year's Eve. And my friend of mine said, what do you want to manifest in the coming year? And without thinking about it, I'm like, if you give me a dream, I'm going to wish big, So I'm like, well, I want to perform with a major rock band. And I just said it out loud. And I kid you not, out of nowhere, the following morning, I got asked to perform with Aerosmith.
What?
And I was like, what? No, that's what I thought. But
that's awesome. So you did New Year's Eve with Aerosmith.
On New Year's Eve, I made the wish. And then I got the following morning, they called to perform with me, for me to perform with them at the American Music Awards. So anyhow, there were 5 of us aerialists, and it was Deborah Brown. She's one of Cirque du Soleil's choreographers. She was choreographing it.
Uh-huh.
And it's the first day in the warehouse, and we're for rehearsal. And she puts on the music, and she says, "Play." And I'm like, "What's she talking about? What do you mean?" But I go up there and I start doing my tricks, and she immediately starts yelling at me, and she's like, "Christine, stop posing." And I'm like, oh, okay. So maybe she wants more dynamic elements. So I start throwing out my drops and my rolls, and she's still yelling at me like, Christine, you keep posing. Stop doing that. And I'm like, finally I get down and I'm like, I'm sorry, but that was every trick I know how to do. Like, I don't know what you want from me, And so she sends up my friend Bianca to show me. Bianca's worked with her before. And I swear, Bianca does one trick. She does a hip key, which is a very simple aerial skill. And by the end of this hip key, I have tears rolling down my face because it's like she hip keys and she's thrashing on and she rips at the fabric, she throws it down, and suddenly she realizes that she threw her child on the floor, and she slowly gathers the fabric into her hands and she caresses against her face and her breast. And I'm like, oh my God, I get it. It's not about the ta-da, It's about how do you make people feel when you're moving and, with your movement. And that was this huge turning point for me. And I ever since that moment, I've been trying to figure out how do I make people feel with my movement in my life,
Have you figured out any answers?
Well, I created a workshop that teaches lessons that help you to do that help improve routines and enhance them in order to, but it's just a process. Like, you're never going to get there. I'm never going to get there. It's a journey, we're going to keep improving. So.
Yeah, it almost feels like with that kind of work, there's no place to get, right? There's no destination.
Yeah, there's no
destination. Because what's really
fun
to watch on stage even is like the journey of that.
Exactly. Yeah. You watch Cirque du Soleil and it's like, no, who knows the story? Nobody can figure out what the hell they're doing.
Especially not these days. Nope. Yeah. Yeah, I just had last week, I had a podcast interview with Jonathan Moran. And he was talking about Isabelle Chassé, obviously one of the aerial greats, and how he said he would watch her act every night for 5 years when he was on Kidam with her. And every night he would cry.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
like, how do you get to that place?
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah.
Your story just reminded me of that because it's so fresh in my editing brain. And I do feel like
Hmm.
that's something that like really is a huge gap between like practitioners who are really new to aerials and people who've
Yeah.
been doing it for a while. You're a performer and also a teacher. You
Yeah.
mentioned you have a workshop. So how much of when you teach is like skill-based work and how much of your teaching is artistry and the kinds of things you're talking about?
Well, I co-own an aerial retreat center in Costa Rica with my husband. We have a flying trapeze on the land and a giant open air aerial deck.
And your
And so,
husband opened TSNY too, is that correct?
yeah, he was
Okay.
the co-founder of TSNY. He sold that company to his business partners, and we opened Airborne Arts in Costa Rica instead.
Love
After
that.
that, when I teach my own retreats, I try to make it a mixture of both. Like I love teaching new skills into sequences along with performance enhancement techniques. Like that's my favorite.
Hmm.
Sometimes I travel and I teach at other people's studios or schools, and I ask them, what would you like? You know, like I'm open to just teaching tricks, or I'm open to just teaching creativity exercises, or I can do a mixture. Whatever people want, I'm good for.
Very cool. Do you know that you have a trick named after you? The
You
Van Loo?
know, I've heard that so many times, and every time I'm like, well, what trick is it? And it's always a different trick.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, so I know the Van Loo, really simple. It's like you just wrap one leg over and over again and you kind of like pull over so you can do a knee hook.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
That's what
I know.
that's
I
what
don't call
people
it
have
the band
described to
move.
me as the
I
Van.
love that other
No,
people
I
do.
and then you're a speaker, a keynote speaker.
I am. Yeah, that's my newest venture. I'm really excited about it, actually.
What is it?
Well, I speak on how to rise above your limiting beliefs, and I have a few different speeches on things like that, about like how to peak your confidence, how to make fear your ally, how to undefine yourself so that basically you expand your sense of who you are and what you're capable of achieving, things like that. And I basically tell stories from my life as an aerialist and as an athlete on how to rise above your limiting beliefs. My last big speech was in Romania at a women's leadership conference in front of like 700 women. And I have another speech coming up March 20th. That's like in a couple of weeks in San Diego. I got another one coming up in between Denver and Boulder. Pretty excited about it. I love it.
Do you ever tell the story you just told me about Deborah Brown telling you to quit posing?
I've told that story like on my own land and in Costa Rica. I've told that story, but I haven't told it yet to a big crowd. I've told other stories instead.
Because
Yeah,
I feel
I mean, I
like
have
those
so
kinds
many
of
stories. So.
what's another one you've got? Tell me more
Oh my
stories. I want to
gosh.
hear.
Well, do you want to hear about how I became like how I just started aerial artistry?
Yeah.
Another part of, I guess, beginning of this. So when I was a kid, I mean, I'm sure you've all had flying dreams, right? But as a kid, I
For
had
sure.
them all the time, and I was obsessed with making them a reality. I mean, I didn't care what anyone said about a little thing called gravity. I spent all my time jumping off chairs, flapping my arms. Fast forward 20 years, I found myself working for an entertainment company in Florida, as we do. And
Mhm.
I was miserable and I was embarrassed because I had to wear this hideous neon psychedelic full body unitard that looked like a box of Skittles vomited all over me with a matching cone hat.
Are there pictures?
Oh God, I hope not. And I had to like prance around on stage, a 1 7-time national champion, like looking like the rainbow bright unicorn, this like ridiculous outfit as
Yeah.
background eye candy for this aerial act.
Hmm.
Now, while I was watching this aerial act and prancing around, none of this spandex nonsense mattered because all I could think about was how badly I wanted to be up there flying. Well, one day my boss called me and he said, Christine, would you be willing to learn 3 basic aerial tricks for our upcoming show? Well, I mean, I was in my car on my way to Miami before he hung up the phone. I was living in Orlando at
Hmm.
the time, by the way. And so every Thursday from then on, I'd spend 4 hours driving from Orlando to Miami, where I spent the remainder of each week training with an old acrobatic teammate of mine who had just retired from Cirque du Soleil, you know?
Hmm.
And I swear this guy looked like an upside down triangle. He had like big beefy pectoral muscles and an itty bitty waist and long flowing black hair. And so I started calling him Fabio, you know. And I will never forget my first aerial training experience with Fabio. So we trained in this oven of a warehouse filled with musty circus costumes on the cordelise, which, as you guys might know, is a canvas rope that hangs 32 feet from the ceiling. And it might look like your typical PE high school rope, but you can imagine like flipping and dangling by one foot on a rope. You know, it hurts like hell. So I started learning the cordelise by climbing one pole up the rope at a time, inch by inch, like a caterpillar. And the first time I managed to climb all the way to the top, so high I could touch the warehouse ceiling. It's like 3 stories high. I was so excited. It was like I'd won the Olympics. Unfortunately,
wait, because you were, even though you had like all of this skill from gymnastics, you like,
oh, it was hard. And it was 5 years later after I retired. It was 5 years after I retired I even touched a rope or anything.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, like at the same time, I was like, my muscles basically, they turned into jello. And I slid down the rope like a fireman's pole. And I looked at my hands and I had torn all of the skin off my palms. And horrified, I was like, oh, well, there goes the end of my aerial career. Only 2 minutes later, Fabio was like, up again. And I was like, excuse me, did you see my hands? And he said, yeah, but Christine, you need to build up enough strength. So I kid you not, I bandaged my hands in toilet paper and duct tape. And I climbed that rope.
What?
And
duct tape?
And duct tape. Or one of those kind of tape. Maybe it was athletic tape, I don't know. And 2 hours later, my hands looked like claws. My forearms were swollen like Popeye. And I got to my hotel room caked in dirt, sweat, and blood. And I laid down on the bed, too tired to even cry. And the only thing that had energy were my thoughts. And they were abusive. They were like, I can't do this. This is way too hard. It's too painful. And you're too old. You're not strong enough. If you're not an aerialist, if you can imagine doing pull-ups for 6 to 8 minutes straight, like basically the entire length of the Bohemian Rhapsody song, you get an idea of what it's like to be an aerial act. It's hard. And I doubted I had that in me. So my last thought was, I'm not good enough. Now, I'm sure everybody can relate to like avoiding something, like applying for a job or, you know, asking somebody you're interested in out for dinner or asking for a raise or speaking in public or anything because you thought you weren't good enough. Well, that's what I was suffering at the time. I laid there for a long time feeling sorry for myself. And then I got up and I packed my bag and I was on my way out the door to quit. And just before I left, I looked at myself square in the face in the mirror and I asked myself, what do you want? Like, what do you really want beneath all of this? Mm-hmm. And I heard this little voice in my mind say, I want to fly, you know?
Yeah.
And I thought of what Toni Morrison wrote. She wrote this. She said, if you want to fly, you have to give up the things that bring you down. And so I knew in that moment what I had to give up. I had to give up being comfortable for a while. So, yeah, and I went back to it and I stuck with it. And that's the thing is like, we have this thing about discomfort that we make it our enemy. We judge it. And it has to be, we have to accept it as part of the journey, you know? Once you learn to train yourself to associate the discomfort of your challenges with the outcome of success, that's when we can start making strides in our life.
I love that. I think it's very true. I also think that sometimes in circus, there's a culture of overtraining, though, of abuse of the body, that it becomes really hard to find that line.
It does
between like giving up
right.
discomfort and also like treating yourself well enough to like honor that you're going to get to where you want to go because you haven't gotten injured or something like that. Totally. Did you ever find those moments in your process?
Absolutely. And another thing too, like I think like what we were saying earlier about the ta-da, like the audience, honestly, the audience doesn't know what tricks you're doing that are hard or easy. I mean, sometimes there are tricks that I do that I'm killing myself and I don't get a clap, you know? And then I go into like, foot locks and I do a split and the audience goes wild. And I'm like, what are you kidding me? So when people are training and they're doing like serious, like dangerous release moves, and I mean, that's great that they're challenging themselves, but it's not necessarily even necessary, to be the great thing in the show.
I do think it depends, though. I think it's interesting. Right now, I'm in Montreal, which is like the capital of like hardcore technique and like big tricks and, innovation. And people are always trying to be like, quote unquote, the best.
Yeah.
And I do think it's an interesting question of like wondering who you're performing for,
Yeah.
because I see a lot of people here like performing for their peers.
That's right.
Because we all know what hard tricks are.
And that's when the pressure comes on when you're performing before your peers.
That's it, right? And to go to the festivals or to go to kind of like, there is a technical level sometimes that has to be reached. It's interesting. And that's what I think is interesting about, like that kind of motivational stuff is, and what I'm kind of like breaching right now. I wonder if you've ever had this where there's like a vulnerability in artistry, right? Like what it would feel like to realize you would throw in this story. I just love that story that you told about this woman who realized she had thrown her child on the floor and like picking it up, like the vulnerability of going through all of those emotions in front of somebody.
Yeah.
But there's also, I think in circus, this very interesting physical vulnerability, that you have to kind of face the fact that you're doing, I promise there's a question at the end of all this. But this fact that you have to like face the very real like aspect of mortality and that you're physically in some disciplines compromising or putting yourself in danger. Do you find that the kind of motivational limiting beliefs and that kind of work has helped you or has helped other people with that aspect of the work? Or do you even address it?
Like with my fear?
Yeah.
Well, let's see. I mean, I have a story about fear. Well, I have two stories. One, the other thing, you mentioned something about exposing yourself vulnerability wise emotionally. And I have definitely done routines where like I broke up with a boyfriend that I was in love with, and I made the whole routine about that breakup, and no, the audience didn't know, but I could feel it, and I'm sure they could feel, like they couldn't see what the story was, but they could feel what it was. So there's that. In terms of fear, can you repeat your question just so I make sure I understand it before I answer the wrong question?
Yeah, totally. It was like, I make up these questions like as I'm talking because I don't like to be too canned or else I feel like I don't listen as well. But so I guess my question is, emotional vulnerability is scary.
Yeah.
But it's not nearly as scary as actual physical vulnerability, which sometimes as acrobats we can feel. And I guess I'm thinking more specifically about mental blocks around tricks. Because sometimes there's a perception of danger, like when you're trying a new drop and you've done the drill 1,000 times and it's there. But then how do you like really take that next step? Or you keep bailing out of a trick that you could probably do if you didn't keep bailing, but you keep bailing. How to overcome those kind of more physical manifestations of fear.
Right. Well, I have a few things to say about fear. One is that like changing the mechanics of fear and the fact that I have like I said, I co-own an aerial retreat center in Costa Rica with my husband. And so on a daily basis, we have people, first-time flyers, flying on the trapeze, and they climb up there, basically the height of a flagpole, and they're standing on this little bitty platform, and they're like terrified, and they're kind of frozen. A lot of them, they're catatonic. It's kind of funny to watch, actually.
Yeah, I used to work board at a flying trapeze rig, and it's very fun. Yeah.
It's true. And so basically it's like your mind is telling you this story like, oh my God, this is really high, I may fall. And then your brain shoots you some chemicals, and then you get a little more frozen, and then your brain changes the story like, oh my God, I think I actually will fall and I'm going to die. And like more chemicals, more physical reaction, more stiffness. And so it's like you become just stuck. And because of all these chemicals in this story that keeps making a negative feedback loop. But if you can change the mechanics of the fear by being like, okay, listen, first of all, take a deep breath, shake it out, laugh, smile, like do the opposite mechanical thing than what fear is doing. You know what I mean? That kind of changes the negative feedback loop, and you're able to access your body more. Does that make sense?
So smiling will help with the
Well,
fear?
smiling, shaking, taking a big yawn and laughing, like, because when you're afraid, you're kind of just like your shoulders tense up. If you lift them up, if you just lower your shoulders and you relax and you like
Yeah.
try to change, just everything that you wouldn't do that
That's
in
interesting.
fear.
Because like when I mentioned I used to work on board, and I remember those terrified people would come up and they'd be like white knuckling, the all of the guy lines and everything that's like holding the board on, or they wouldn't reach out for the bar, and they would always ask me, they'd be like, so how long have you been doing this, and I'm like, nah, I don't know, 2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
I kind of just walked on. Or they'd be like, you've got me, right? And I'm like, probably, like just making kind of
Right.
like silly jokes or making light of the situation to kind of
Yeah.
help them get that fear space. That's interesting.
Exactly. Exactly.
Mm.
And then the other thing I have to say about fear is my friend Kristen Ulmer, she makes my aerial act. Like I did an aerial act off a hot air balloon 90 feet in the air over a 9-story building for Cirque du Soleil. And she makes that aerial act look like a nap in a hammock because she's like was rated the world's best female extreme skier for 12 years. And she was voted one of the world's top 10 skiers most likely to die because she would like out ski avalanches and do flips off from 100-foot cliffs and so forth.
Damn.
Yeah. So anyhow, this girl was like every article ever written about her, they called her fearless. And she was like, the thing was she had repressed her fear. So, which is not really that healthy to do, by the way. And she started noticing that she was like having all these physical injuries that wouldn't heal and like mental problems. And she would get injured. She would get injured and her body would fail to heal. She suffered adrenal fatigue disorder. She'd have to like sleep all day just to have enough energy to go to dinner with her girlfriend, and her love of skiing just turned into hatred. So she went to all these different doctors. Nobody knew what was wrong with her. And then she ended up going to this Buddhist temple, like a Buddhist temple. And she met this guy who teaches something called Big Mind. I don't know if you ever heard of Big Mind.
No, never.
So it's a mixture of Zen concepts and psychology techniques. And so think about it like this.
Wait, so I'm sorry. It's a Zen Buddhist psychology technique?
Well, he made it up, this guy named Genpo Roshi. He mixed Zen concepts with the psychological techniques that are used in psychology in therapy. So if you can think about yourself as a corporation made up of thousands of different employees or aspects of yourself, with fear being just one of the employees, like if you ever saw the movie Inside Out, I don't know, the cartoon Inside Out.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of like that. So each of these employees perceives the world differently, wants to be heard, thinks he or she is the boss, in charge of the other employees, and has different reactions, opinions about how the company should be run. So if you can imagine, this is the kind of mess that this can cause in us. We label some of these employees, including fear, negative. Like we think of fear as our anger, like as negative things. And we persecute them by like ignoring them or suppressing them or fighting against them. Like, you read all these articles or hear these things like, let's conquer fear and kill our fear and all this, like it's this negative, bad thing. But the thing is that fear is actually essential and has kept us alive for a millennia, and it's a primary emotion. It's not something you can get rid of or transcend, and nor should you even want to. And if you resist fear, it strengthens. If you try to control it, it ends up controlling you. And despite all the negative talk that you hear about it, it's not a weakness and it's not bad. It's just this energy that we have in our body. So in Big Mind, what they do is you basically learn how to speak directly to your fear or to any other aspect of yourself. And I taught a workshop with Kristen where I taught acrobatics and she taught Big Mind. And she turned to me and I was like the first guinea pig. And she said, "May I speak to the voice of fear?" Now, I didn't know what to expect, but I played along by relaxing my mind. And I suddenly felt this kind of like mental shift in my perspective. And I said, "This is the voice of fear." And Kristen said, "Nice to meet you. What is your job or your purpose?" And now, as an athlete and an aerialist, I suffered a lot of fear in my life, and I planned on waging war on my fear, But what I heard myself answer from the voice of fear, the voice said, "My job is to protect Christine because I love her." And I was like, oh my God, And I was like, wow, this part of me that I'd always viewed as my enemy was like, I realized was on my side and loved me as much as my own mother loves me,
Yeah.
So Kristen asked, this voice different questions. She's like, is it a difficult job that you have? And the fear answered, are you kidding me? Have you seen what she does for a living? It's a full pain in the ass job I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. So, anyhow, like I realized my voice of fear had a sense of humor, like, but anyhow, from that day on, like I learned how to speak to my fear, and we kind of co-create my life now. Like there are times when I do a job and like think that things are going wrong, or like something's wrong with my fabric, and I'm like, okay, fear, help me out here. I need help. And like my fear gives me suggestions, and sometimes I'm like, if you don't want to do this job, we're not going to do it. Like we're buddy now, you know.
You embrace the fear.
I embrace the fear. It's like my ally. It totally helps me, you know?
It's different too from like acknowledging fear. You know, I feel like I'm more of like I'm like, okay, yeah, you're afraid. All right, we're going to do it anyway.
Right.
But
right.
I don't think my fear helps me right now. I think my fear is kind of like, hey. And I'm like, yeah. I know you're there. Interesting. Yeah. I never thought of it as like another part of me. Yeah. Wait, this sounds really cool though. So you teach acrobatics and she teaches big. Is this in Costa Rica?
No, we just did one workshop at Natalie's studio actually a few years ago. That's when I learned it.
Okay. Gotcha. In LA.
She teaches it in skiing normally, but we just thought of co-creating a workshop together, and that worked out pretty well.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was fun.
Cool.
I love learning stuff.
I want to hear another story.
What else do I have to tell you?
But no, we've got, okay, so we've talked fear, how you knew like what your life, Ariel, was your goal, your job, your career. As far as that kind of work, you've mostly been in North America, I take it, working? Or what have you, what have your like performance highlights, things you've loved to do?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so, well, for the last 2 years, I've been working with a show called Cirque du Soleil, and we perform with live symphony orchestras worldwide. So I've been traveling pretty much around the world, a lot of it in the U.S. and Canada, but also worldwide. I toured with Paul McCartney, and that was really fun. That was probably one of my favorite tours.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, that was great. And then, of course, lots of, American Music Awards, the Grammys, movies, television, videos, all that stuff.
And do you do your own booking, or do you have an agent?
Honestly, it's mostly referral work, or I'll work for the same company for a long time, and they just won't get rid of me. So I'm actually looking for stuff right now, though, and in terms of performing and teaching and speaking. So if anybody needs a speaker or performer or teacher, I'm available. So
great, cool. Where can people find you?
Oh, at ChristineVanLoo.com is my website, spelled ChristineVanLoo.com. Yeah, awesome. I'm on Instagram and all that. You just saved me a whole bunch of it.
Yeah, we'll post all that too, for sure. Where's Van Loo from?
It's Dutch.
Okay. I was wondering, I've always wondered if that's your real last name.
Oh, yeah.
Or if it's a stage
name. Who would change it to that if it wasn't?
I don't know. It's cute. It's kind of like whimsical. I have a friend, though, and her last name is LaFrance. Clara LaFrance.
Well, that's cool.
I know. And a lot of people think that that's a fake name, too, but it's just her last name.
That's a cool name. I like that one.
Right? I love a two-sound name, like a Van Loo, LaFrance, like things that have like single syllable, but like multiple words.
Totally.
Anyway. Nice. So keynote speaking and hanging out in Costa Rica with your husband. Is this life? Anything else you want to do, build? Where are you going next?
I just finished writing a book, which I'm having published soon. And it's called Falling to the Top, How to Rise Above Your Limiting Beliefs.
Okay.
Book of my stories and lessons that I've learned in life.
And how did you get into all this like limiting belief mindset work?
That's a great question. I've always been interested in it. And I think probably it stems back from when I was a competitor. Well, I wasn't actually naturally talented or gifted as an athlete. I was pretty much the worst student in my class for a really long time.
Everybody
Yeah.
says that.
Oh, but it was true in my case. It really was.
Sure.
So, you want me to tell you that story?
Please. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, I had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So, my parents always
Yeah.
said it was either a choice between acrobatics or Ritalin. So then,
That's really funny.
yeah.
Okay. And so you chose acrobatics.
I chose acrobatics, and frankly, like my dad.
I chose both, but that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. So acrobatics is a partnering gymnastics sport, and my dad took me down. Well, I was frankly like my parents told me about it, and that it was on Saturday mornings, and frankly, I was kind of lukewarm on the idea of going to class because Scooby Doo played on Saturday mornings, and I was going to miss my show. You know?
Yeah. Priorities, man. Totally.
But I relented, and I went to acrobatics, and when I saw kids flying through the air and dancing and tumbling and bouncing on one another, like my mind was blown. So I started taking class, but like I said, I was the worst student in the class. Like I would trip over my own feet. My arms were really skinny and not strong enough to hold up my weight. I was the last student to learn every trick and move up in levels. So basically, I always felt like I'm not good enough. But on the other end of the spectrum, there was this girl named Stacy Tutton. And when I was a 10-year-old junior level acrobat, Stacy was on the senior elite team in my gym, and she was everything I aspired to be. She was like Navy SEAL strength in a petite 14-year-old girl's body and perfect masterpiece handstands. Anyhow, it was around this same time my mom went to a team fundraising garage sale, and she bought me Stacy Tutton's leotard. Now, I didn't know whether to try this leotard on or to frame it, but I tried it on.
Wait, how did you know it was hers? Did it have her name on it, or had you?
No, I would have recognized it anywhere. Like I knew her leotards. You know, I watched her all the time. It was a simple black leotard with a white stripe down each side. You know.
Yeah.
Just that simple thing. But yeah, so I put it on and I didn't take it off for 2 weeks straight. So it looked like a simple black black polyester leotard, but in truth, like it was magic for me because normally my handstands balanced about as well as a wet spaghetti noodle. But when I put on this leotard and I would kick into a handstand, like I became Stacy Tutton, and my muscles would squeeze and my rib cage would engage and my muscles would tighten. And very soon on, my handstands became as good as Stacy's handstands. Now, I know you're probably not buying the magic leotard, but this is definitely...
Actually, I'm like trying to figure out how I can get one of Stacy Tutton's leotards. That sounds amazing.
But there's like definitely magic involved, and it was the magic of pretending. And I looked up the word pretend, and I know you probably... I bet you think you know what the word pretend means. And some synonyms include like bluffing, counterfeit, deception, dupe, sham, fake, feign, fool, lie, all negative stuff. But let me give you the original meaning of the word pretend. I think you're going to be surprised. So pretend comes from the Latin word pretendo, meaning to stretch out before, to aspire, and to lay claim. Now, do you remember like when you were a kid and you embodied the original...
Wait, can you say that again? What is it? To stretch out?
Stretch out before, to aspire to...
To stretch out before, okay, that makes sense.
To aspire to, and to lay claim. So basically, when you pretend, you're aspiring to do something and you're laying claim to that becoming you, you know?
Wow.
Yeah. Now, do you remember when you were a kid and you embodied the original meaning of the word pretend? Like you tried on roles.
Oh my God, I was the queen of pretend.
You know? Yeah, you tried on...
I feel like I still am sometimes.
That's right. You pretended, and that's like everything was possible. But as we grow older, we just kind of stop pretending, and things started rigid. And yeah, so I've pretended myself into becoming an aerialist, into becoming an acrobat, into becoming a keynote speaker. Like I'm all about pretending. So I
love that. Yeah. It's interesting. And that's the whole, like, you pretend your way. And then at some point you have to like look around and be like, oh yeah, I actually am these things.
Yeah.
Like, you are Christine Van Loo, the aerialist. You have multiple tricks named after you, apparently.
Right.
You know, like, because I also know people, and I've felt this way sometimes too, where I'm like, okay, I've pretended my way this far. Now, when are they going to figure out that I'm a liar? You know?
Right.
But it's like,
Yeah.
but I love that idea of just having like a magic thing that like gives you that strength too. Because
Exactly.
sometimes, yeah, it's actually because it was actually you, right?
Yeah.
That was like doing the handstands and all the work.
Yeah.
You just needed a little help from this like magical thing.
And by pretending that I was Stacy and then emulating her athletic qualities, I didn't become Stacy. I became an improved version of myself. Now, I didn't go on to win four national championships like Stacy did, though, but I won 7 of them.
No, you won 7 apparently. So screw Stacy. Oh my gosh, Christine, this is awesome. I don't usually when people come on, they don't have stories already prepared. So I'm like kind of pulling it out of them or like asking them questions or this. So it's so cool to have you like hear all these kind of like ideas and things that you really like fleshed out through your keynote speaking and through your book. If people want to buy your book, can they find it on Amazon? Is it coming out? Is it out?
It will be out. You know, I haven't even gotten that far. I'm in the publishing phase of getting my cover done. So, if they check back on my website, for sure, I'll have every possible avenue written on there.
Okay, cool. And maybe like once you write it, I'll like keep stalking you and I'll get a copy and I'll give it to one of my Patreons or something.
That would be great.
Because that would
it's already written. I just need to like get the cover and everything formatted. So yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. What was it like to write a book?
Oh, so fun. I love it. I love writing. I've always loved writing.
Really? Because some people are like, oh my God, it's terrible. I could never do it again. You know, like, writing's the worst. But you liked it. That's awesome. Did. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Well, I have one last question that I always ask at the end of every interview. And I feel like you have just filled the interview full of these things. But the last question, it seems so redundant. It's like silly for me to ask. But what advice would you give to yourself at the beginning of your career?
That whenever I feel the feeling of feeling not good enough, to know that everybody feels that and that's fine, that's okay, because nobody is good enough until the moment that they are. And like that's just the natural route to achievement, where nobody starts out running a marathon. We all start out crawling, baby crawling, you know.
So true. Even Stacy probably started out crawling.
Yep, exactly.
Thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was my interview with Christine Van Loo. As I mentioned at the end of the interview, this interview was a little different than a lot of the ones I give because usually the people I have on are amazing, accomplished artists, but they are not usually accustomed to giving speeches or being speakers. Whereas Christine, because she has made this career pivot and decided to go into keynote speaking, had a lot of material prepared already that she could talk about on the podcast, which was super cool. So Christine's keynote speaking and what she kind of touched on was working with what's called limiting beliefs or a limiting belief structure. And this is a very common term in business training, mindset training. It's pretty popular. Limiting beliefs are defined by changingminds.org as those which constrain us in some ways. Just by believing them, we do not think, do, or say the things that they inhibit. And in doing so, we impoverish our lives. We may have beliefs about rights, duties, abilities, permissions, and so on. And because we have these beliefs, we act in certain ways or don't act in certain ways. And that causes us to have certain outcomes that we may or may not desire for our lives. So Christine told 4 stories today that kind of went over some of the limiting beliefs she had. The first one was when she was working with Deborah Brown. I call it the stop posing story because it's the one where Deborah Brown, who's a very well-known choreographer for Cirque du Soleil and other companies and projects, yelled at Christine and was like, "Stop posing, Christine." Christine had this limiting belief that all she had to offer, she came down off the silks and she said, "I've given you all I have." And that was based on this limiting belief that Christine was only her flexibility and her strength and her skills. But when you're creating art, you have to put in so much more than that. There's an emotional component, a vulnerability. Sometimes people talk about it as hiding behind the tricks. When you have a whole bunch of cool things that you can do in your repertoire, but you're not actually adding any of your own flair or interpreting them in your own way. You're hiding behind the tricks. And so Christine had to really dig deep and figure out what else she had. The second story I wrote as Flying versus Discomfort. And this was the story that Christine started to talk about when she burned her palms on the rope because she went to Miami to train with her Fabio instructor. And she climbed up and got a really bad rope burn as she was coming back down, which is unfortunate, but it happens. And she was burned so badly that she just wanted to give up. And she didn't think she could do it. And then she remembered this Toni Morrison quote, "If you want to fly, you have to give up the things that bring you down." And in this whole idea of limiting beliefs bring you down, the belief that she had was that she could just be comfortable. And she had to give up that belief for a little while and live with discomfort in order to see progress. And I think that's a super cool lesson. I challenged it a bit because I was like, well, I think that sometimes people become kind of a slave to their discomfort. They get really a little too comfortable with being uncomfortable or in a state of discomfort. And they end up suffering unnecessarily. And I asked her about how do you overcome some of the beliefs that you're supposed to be kind of in a state of always suffering or always working hard when sometimes things can come quite easily? And how do you deal with the very real challenges such as injury or fear? And what I mean by real is that these are actually like physical things that could happen to you in the real world rather than just operating from kind of a psychological or mindset approach. However, Christine, through her story about her friend, the competitive skier, taught me and kind of explained that mindset and your physical reality are very closely linked. Imagine that. So her friend, the skier, who was voted, top 10 skiers most likely to die, which who is making that list? Anyway, she would repress her fear. And when you repress these ideas or these aspects of yourself, they will start to show up in other ways. And for her friend, this was illness, this was injury, this was being very tired, taking all day to sleep, just so she could go out and have dinner with her friends. These kinds of symptoms of fear. And the way that Christine describes overcoming this was having a different relationship with fear than avoiding it, right? And I think with all limiting beliefs, you have to do this. You have to acknowledge that they're there, but then you also have to be in constant dialogue because these limiting beliefs or these feelings of fear, they're not going to go away. They're not going to magically disappear. I mean, Christine is a 7-time world champion who then made a switch to aerial arts. And in my mind, that should be very easy. But Christine describes it as a very tricky thing. And now as she's going into the world of keynote speaking, I can imagine there's a whole bunch of fear and limiting beliefs coming up around that. When I create this podcast every week, there's a whole bunch of fear and limiting beliefs that come up around it as well. What I find the most helpful is to be in dialogue with this. The last story is my favorite story. I've called it The Magic Leotard. And it's the story of Stacey Tutton, Tutton, if you want to Google her like I did and fall down a rabbit hole of 1980s sport acrobatic gymnastics. It's pretty awesome to watch. But Christine tells the story about how her mother happened upon Stacey Tutton's leotard at a garage sale and gave it to Christine, and Christine wore it and was imbued with this kind of magic, right? Because she pretended that she was Stacey. And you hear this a lot, this like idea of fake it till you make it. And it makes me think about actually this quote from a juggler, Wes Peden, who's actually also been on the podcast, where he was giving a workshop once. And one of his instructions to people was just pretend like you've already nailed the trick when you're practicing it. Pretend you can already do it. And this is kind of a strategy to overcome a limiting belief, that you put yourself in a mindset that's like, oh, I've already done this, I'm going to do it again. Which seems like really counterintuitive, right? Because it's not reality. You haven't done it, and who knows if you're going to do it. But I do think that there's an aspect of confidence that you have to find ways to access, and sometimes tricking yourself into being confident, or in the case of the magic leotard, getting this object, getting this costume that will give you confidence can be the key to success. Christine Van Loo is online, christinevanloo.com. She's also on Instagram, Christine Van Loo, all one word, no spaces. For aerial training tips and inspiration, you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at _artist_athlete. Why did I just totally forget that? I say it literally every week. _artist_athlete. I'm online, theartistathlete.com, Facebook. I'm not on Twitter, but I am on Patreon, patreon.com/theartistathlete. Thanks for tuning in, friends, fans, and enemies. Talk at you next week. The Artist Athlete podcast is supported solely by donations from people like you. Here's what some of those people have to say.
Aloha! My name is Beth Russell, and I live on the beautiful island of Maui, Hawaii. I am an aerial artist and movement instructor specializing in chakra yoga to keep me balanced and grounded. I play with silks, trapeze, lyra, rope, acro, aerial yoga and dance, slacklining, pole, bungee, and climbing. Really anything that goes up and allows me to explore 3D space. You can find my dedicated aerial page on Instagram at Maui Aerialist. If you find yourself coming to Maui, let's play.
Hey there, friends, fans, and enemies. This is Chris Alston, Patreon of the Artist Athlete podcast. Straps artist and lyra performer and acrobat out of Greenville, South Carolina. So, if you're ever passing through, make sure to stop in and see me and my friends. We have a wonderful space, and we'd love to see you.
Hi, my name is Erica Lee. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm an aerialist. I teach performing arts to elementary school during the day and do pole and swings and rope by night. I really, really like the Artist Athlete podcast because it gives me a lot of circus goals to look forward to. It gives me a lot of insight on what's going on around the world in circus. And that's why I'm Patreon.
Hello, all. Thank you for tuning in to the Artist Athlete podcast. I am Opal Schwartz from Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you're ever in the cities, feel free to stop by the Aviary Minneapolis. It's a great time. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and goodbye.
Hey there, artists and athletes. This is Andy Smith, owner and artistic director at Saltaire Circus School in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. And I want to thank you for contributing to the Artist Athlete podcast. If you ever find yourself down in Florida, come check us out. Whether you're an artist, athlete, or someone ordinary just looking to be extraordinary, we got a place for you.